Eurico, você está no mudo.
Bem-vindos ao terceiro encontro da série Reforma Tributária. O que podemos aprender com a experiência internacional do VAT, que é a sigla internacional, ou do que nós chamamos aqui no Brasil de IBS, Imposto sobre Bens e Serviços, do Núcleo de Estudos Fiscais da Escola de Direito da Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Sou Eurico De Santi, professor da Escola de Direito da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, onde tenho a honra de dividir a coordenação do Núcleo de Estudos Fiscais com o professor Isaías Coelho, que está aqui conosco. É importante destacar que as opiniões expostas neste evento não se confundem com as posições institucionais da Fundação Getúlio Vargas e que todos os aqui presentes concordam espontaneamente em divulgar sua imagem e permitir que ela seja veiculada pelos canais da Fundação Getúlio Vargas. O evento também é coordenado pela professora Melina Rocha, da York University, e pela professora Rita de la Féria, professora catedrática da Universidade de Leeds, no Reino Unido. A apresentação de hoje, pelo professor Michael Smart, pretende aprofundar o debate que vem ocorrendo, especialmente na última semana do Brasil, em razão da apresentação do projeto do VAT federal, chamado Contribuição sobre Bens e Serviços, pela sigla CBS, na última terça-feira, dia 21/7, pelo governo federal, que vem pautando esse debate, e a principal questão é nós entendermos, já que nós estamos mergulhados na nossa própria experiência interna com os nossos semi-VATs há mais de 50 anos, é nós trabalharmos essa série para entendermos a experiência internacional. E um ponto importante para destacar que é notável que nós temos, ao mesmo tempo, uma proposta de IVA amplo, oferecida pela PEC 45, através da Câmara dos Deputados, uma outra proposta de IVA amplo também oferecida pelo Senado Federal, através da PEC 110, e agora uma proposta de IVA também desses mesmos moldes, proposta a semana passada pelo governo federal. E tudo isso, professor Michael Smart, dentro das características de um moderno imposto sobre valor agregado, como denominado hoje pelo professor Isaías, numa entrevista que ele concedeu ao Valor Econômico, na versão 4.0 do VAT. Ou seja, com base ampla sobre bens e serviços, com alíquota uniforme, não cumulatividade plena, completa desoneração das exportações, ativos permanentes e investimentos e devolução automática de créditos acumulados em prazo de até 60 dias, que é muito para o Brasil, e em dinheiro. Essa é a grande novidade. Dentro da sua fala e do seu paper, eu já endereço um destaque, que é justamente a questão do compliance. Em razão da complexidade do sistema brasileiro, nós temos dificuldade, enfim, do fisco acompanhar e fiscalizar os contribuintes, mas nosso principal problema é a falta de compliance do próprio fisco, que sistematicamente não tem a prática de devolver e honrar os créditos acumulados dos contribuintes, em especial nas exportações. Então, nós temos que mudar aí a percepção, a prática do fisco instaurada aqui no direito brasileiro. Além disso, em face do artigo do professor Michael Smart, oferecido previamente aos debatedores, inicio com uma contextualização do artigo do professor Michael com os problemas que nós temos no diálogo, nas narrativas sobre a implantação do IVA no Brasil. Acho que a primeira questão é como que a experiência internacional entende e compreende a mudança dos preços relativos na instalação de um novo IVA, com alíquotas uniformes. Esse tema elevou a temperatura na semana passada em razão à proposta do VAT federal, que modifica a carga tributária, em especial do setor de serviços, que hoje em dia paga, no âmbito federal, 3,65% no cumulativo, para 12% no não cumulativo. E aí o grande desafio é entender o que significa essa lógica de mudança de preços relativos na transição de um IVA. Uma outra questão importante, que também está no paper do professor Michael Smart, é a questão que seja na proposta do governo, na chamada CBS, seja na proposta da PEC 45.110, chamada IBS, a tributação no Brasil vem sendo objeto de uma mudança drástica da origem para o destino. E o que a gente pode aprender com a experiência internacional? O que significa essa mudança da origem para o destino, especialmente em países federativos como o Brasil? E, por fim, é a primeira questão que eu enderecei logo no início: como podemos ultrapassar a barreira do non-compliance, em especial na prática dos fiscos brasileiros de não restituírem os créditos acumulados? Temos problema de compliance, e é muito interessante o seu paper, porque diz respeito à análise de como isso reflete na importação num país importador de capital como o Brasil. Mas a grande questão aqui é 12%? Mas vão devolver mesmo os 12% de créditos acumulados? Para apresentar o professor Michael Smart, o comentarista Bernardo Api, economista e diretor do Centro de Cidadania Fiscal, e a nossa mediadora, Bárbara Mengardo, do Jota. Convido a professora Melina Rocha, da York University do Canadá. Bom dia, Melina.
Bom dia, Eurico, bom dia a todos. Bom, hoje a gente tem a honra de receber o professor Michael Smart, que vai apresentar, então, o paper VAT Compliance, Trade and Institution. O professor Michael, ele é economista, professor de economia aqui do Departamento de Economia da Universidade de Toronto. Ele tem PhD, doutorado na Stanford University, mestrado na British Columbia e graduação na McGill University. Ele também já teve diversas posições como visiting professor na Universidade de Munique, na London School of Economics e também no Departamento de Finanças aqui do Canadá. E igualmente também já foi International Research Fellow na Oxford Center for Business Taxation. O professor Smart tem uma lista enorme de publicações em finanças públicas, em política tributária e VAT, em IVA também, então por isso ele é um pesquisador renomado nessa área. É um prazer, uma honra estar aqui. Em nome de todos, eu agradeço a sua participação, professor Michael. E para debater, nós vamos ter também o Bernardo Api, que é economista formado pela USP, diretor do CECIF, Centro de Cidadania Fiscal. O Api foi secretário executivo e secretário de Política Econômica do Ministério da Fazenda do governo brasileiro entre 2003 e 2009. Foi sócio-diretor da LCA Consultores e diretor de Estratégia e Planejamento da BMF Bovespa. Também presidiu o Conselho de Administração do Banco do Brasil e o Conselho Nacional de Política Fazendária, o CONFAS. Então, o API também debaterá o paper do professor Michael. Vou passar, então, a palavra para a Bárbara, do Jota, que fará a mediação do evento. Obrigada a todos.
Obrigada, Melina. Queria somente agradecer de novo. É uma honra imensa para mim estar aqui com o paper que a gente vai ouvir hoje, que com certeza vai ser muito interessante. Queria só dar 2 avisozinhos. O primeiro é que hoje, como todos os dias, né, a gente tem tradução simultânea. Então, quem quiser ouvir a tradução para o português, pode colocar na barra embaixo à direita, Interpretation, clicar e colocar em português. Para ouvir somente em inglês, English, e se quer ouvir na língua que está sendo falada, então português e inglês, na hora da apresentação, é só colocar em off. A gente vai também eu vou fazer algumas perguntas, e quem quiser quem estiver assistindo e quiser fazer alguma pergunta, pode mandar aqui pelo Q&A, que também está aqui embaixo. Então, novamente, queria agradecer muito e passar agora a palavra para o professor Michael Smart.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those introductions. Thanks to Professor Rocha, to Professor Santi, and to Professor De La Feria for the chance to talk to you today. I should say that through all my career, I've always dreamed of going to a conference in Brazil. I'm sorry it had to happen this way for the first time, but it's a pleasure to be with you and to be able to talk about our paper at the time of this exciting reform that's happening in Brazil. I'm going to share my screen so you will see my slides. Just bear with me. How's that? Can everybody see? Okay, my co-authors are Peter Morrow and Arthur Swistak, and as Professor Santi explained, this paper is about compliance or non-compliance with VAT. I'll just say a few words on the language that I will use, maybe for the benefit of the translator. I will talk about VAT. Of course, that's equivalent to a tax on goods and services, a CBS. In fact, in Canada, we call it by that name as well, but I will say VAT today. And in speaking about compliance or non-compliance, I'm talking about a wide variety of behaviors, whereby non-compliance I would define as any behaviors that would lead a taxpayer to pay less than the legally due amount of tax. And of course, I'll talk more about how that is happening, but that is what I mean by non-compliance. And this paper is about VAT non-compliance, and particularly the role of imports in influencing how much non-compliance there is within the tax. Let me start by offering some general words about VAT, its design, and what our paper will have to say about that. At the broadest level, this paper is an attempt to answer the question we're all asking, which is VAT a good tax? Is it an efficient, an economically efficient way of raising revenue? In the standard view, which I largely agree with, the standard view is that yes, VAT is an efficient tax. And the reasons are several. In our textbook model of how a VAT should operate, we imagine it being a uniform tax rate applying to most goods and services in the economy, so that relative prices are not changed. That tends to, in a world with full compliance, that tends to minimize the economic cost of raising the revenue and to minimize the revenue loss associated with any economic distortions we have. And so that's one important feature, tax everything at the same rate. But another very important feature of VAT, as is practiced almost everywhere in the world today, is destination basis. That is, the VAT is imposed on all imports at the same standard rate, and VAT is refunded or zero rated on all exports. And so the result of that is to simply raise all domestic prices relative to the world prices of the same goods. The result is this becomes a tax on consumption, which does not distort trade. So that's an important feature of destination basis VATs around the world. And the last part of this is the consumption basis. That is that Professor Santi said, investment goods are fully exempted or zero rated within the tax. Only consumption cash flows are being taxed within the base. And the result is there's no distortion to investment decisions of firms, there's minimal distortions to production decisions of firms, and the result of that, the relative prices at which firms are producing are undistorted as well. So you put those three features together, uniform basis, destination basis, and consumption basis, we have what economists think of as an ideal minimal distortion tax on consumption. But all of that is based on the assumption that everyone pays the tax that they're supposed to pay under this system. In a world of non-compliance, some of this logic will change. And of course, every tax creates some potential for non-compliance problems. VAT does as well. In the case of VAT, we worry particularly that some taxpayers would have an incentive not to register for the tax at all, or if they do register, they would underreport their net sales, underreport sales, or overreport their input purchases, or they would simply falsify invoices in one way or another. And so that's the kind of non-compliance we should be thinking about in the context of this paper. I'll note that there's a potential for that in every sector of the economy, but it may be strongest, the problems of non-compliance under VAT, may be strongest for labor-intensive services, particularly among small firms in the economy. So we should be thinking about service sector firms in this context. And why would we worry about that? Of course, we worry about the revenue loss associated with non-compliance. But even more important, I think, is that at high rates of VAT and without adequate enforcement of the system, then the result of non-compliance behavior may be to encourage informality in the domestic economy and to reduce the productivity of firms in the domestic economy. And so that's why we worry about non-compliance, informality, and a loss in productivity. Now, that applies to all taxes on businesses. We would worry about those things. It is true, it's very important that the design of VAT gives it some advantages in terms of compliance. In particular, because we're designing an invoice and credit tax system, then we have invoices from both sides of every transaction. There's a potential for the tax authority to cross-check those invoices to verify that they are correct. And increasingly, that cross-checking of invoices is part of how tax authorities around the world really do enforce their VATs. But it's not just that. It doesn't rely on the tax authority actually cross-checking every invoice. An important feature of the VAT is that if traders chose not to register for VAT, then of course they would avoid paying tax on their sales, but they would not be able to recover VAT on their inputs. And so that unrecoverable VAT on a non-compliant input purchase is a very important design feature here. It will raise the cost of production for a non-compliant firm, reduce the profits from non-compliance, and therefore hopefully discourage the non-compliance behavior in the first place. And so that's always been the magic bullet, the silver bullet of a VAT system, the essential element that's built into the system to reduce the non-compliance behaviors. Now, let me now talk about the role of imports in all of this. It relies on the same idea of the tax on business inputs and the inability to recover that tax in the case of non-compliance. But imports are a very important part of that idea. The enforcement advantages of VAT are especially strong when business inputs are imported across an international border. And that is because the value of shipments is already known because of customs procedures, and it can be easily checked by customs authorities at the point of importation into the country. As well, there are a lot of small domestic firms in the domestic economy that are subject to the tax, but there's a relatively small number of traders that engage in international importation. So because at the border there's a small number of large traders, enforcement is easier for the tax authority or the customs authority as well. And the last point is that increasingly a large proportion of business inputs are imported across international borders, and that's particularly true in low-income countries, which are the focus of the paper that I'll be talking about today. So imports matter, and the border matters in designing a VAT, even though VAT is intended to be a tax on domestic consumption. And the result of all that is that in most countries, a very large share of VAT revenues is collected at the borders. I should say a disproportionately large share. There's more VAT collected by customs authorities than the share of imports in total consumption for most countries. And so all of these observations should suggest to you that there may be a problem with VAT compliance, but it's mainly for domestic value-added transactions that we have a non-compliance problem. VAT compliance for consumption or indirect consumption inputs that are imported, VAT compliance is probably very high around the world, higher than for domestic value-added at least. And so the result of that is just as input VAT helps to defend the VAT base and prevent non-compliance, import VAT or customs VAT collections help to limit domestic non-compliance problems as well. So imports and the customs authority are a very important part of making VAT work around the world. And so this paper is based on that idea, but instead of just trying to convince you that the customs authority is important in this business, we're going to use that idea in order to estimate the share of VAT that is not collected due to non-compliance in a large group of countries around the world. And so to see how I go from the ideas I've just described to our estimates of VAT non-compliance, let me start with a simple thought experiment. The question is, you think of a country that has a destination basis VAT in place. What happens to the VAT revenues collected by that country when imports rise as a share of consumption? And so you should think of that change in imports as being just a sudden shock or sudden change in the economic environment. Perhaps, for example, there is a depreciation in the exchange rate that makes imports generally more expensive than domestic production, and that would raise imports as a share of consumption, at least in the short run. So what happens in that case to VAT revenues? Well, if there's full compliance with the VAT, if every firm pays what they should pay, then the increase in imports has no impact on VAT revenues. More VAT would be collected at the border, but then that would simply be refunded when those imports are used by firms to create domestic value added on which they pay tax at a later stage in the VAT chain. And so that VAT collected at the border is simply refunded at later stages of production, and the overall VAT collected should remain unchanged as long as consumption in the economy stays unchanged. But that's with full compliance. If there's non-compliance in the domestic economy, then we would expect VAT revenues overall, net VAT revenues, should rise as a result of the increase in imports. And the reason, of course, is that a portion of that extra VAT that's collected at the border is now going to stick to the non-compliant firms who are not paying VAT on their value added, but they're left with higher VAT embedded in their imported inputs. And so overall VAT revenues of the country would rise if there's non-compliance in the domestic economy. And so that simple idea is what drives the estimates in our paper. The correlation in the data, the statistical correlation between imports and VAT revenues, tells us something about the amount or the percentage of domestic non-compliance with the tax. And so we're going to use that idea in this paper to estimate what's known as the compliance gap for VAT in, I think it's 74 different countries around the world. And we're going to do that with a very simple data set based on national accounts of these countries over a period of roughly 25 years. And we're going to therefore learn something about VAT compliance in a lot of countries for which we did not have any data before. And so here's just an illustration of what we're doing. This comes right out of our data set for the country of Peru over the 1995 to 2016 period. And there are two lines here. The first, the red line is the ratio of imports to consumption in the Peruvian national accounts. You can see it goes from roughly 38% up to, that's the right axis. So from roughly 25% up to 45% of consumption, and varies over time. The blue line is a measure of VAT revenues. It's called C efficiency. Many of you, I think if you're involved in this debate, you already know what C efficiency is, but I'll explain it in any case. C efficiency is defined as the VAT revenues of the country divided by the revenues that should be collected by applying the same tax rate to consumption. And so that's a measure of what VAT revenue should be. C efficiency, the ratio of the two, gives you a sense of how strong is the revenue performance of the VAT in the country relative to what an ideal VAT would collect. And so C efficiency tells us something about non-compliance, but of course is influenced by many other factors, not just non-compliance. Almost every country has less than 100% C efficiency, but that reflects many factors. But in this case, we can see that the C efficiency of Peru also rose over the period from 1995 to 2008, very much in line with the import ratio. And it dropped when the import ratio dropped and rose again when the import ratio rose again. And so the correlation of these two series is very strong in Peru. And that, based on our method, that allows us to conclude that the rate of domestic non-compliance in Peru is very strong. The basic story here is these two lines move together in Peru because the only place that Peru can effectively collect its VAT is at the border. And if imports are falling, its VAT revenues are going to fall as well. It doesn't have to look like that. Here's a picture for Canada, and you can see that we see, related kind of variability in the import ratio, the same kind of shocks happening there, but essentially no correlation between the share of imports and consumption in Canada and the share of VAT revenues in the consumption tax revenue that Canada should be collecting. So no correlation for Canada suggests to us that most domestic value added is compliant with VAT in Canada. There's not a big non-compliance problem in Canada. And so simply that method of looking at the correlation between these two series across these countries, that's really all we're doing in this paper in order to estimate the non-compliance rates. And so just a few words on the technical aspects of what I'll talk about in the next couple of minutes. I've already described the method in some detail, and C efficiency is here called E for country I and year T. I'm simply going to be regressing that C efficiency of the country on its import ratio M over C, and the coefficients from this regression are going to allow me to make my inferences about the compliance gaps in the economy. And in particular, using our estimates, and based on the assumption that there's 100% VAT compliance on legal imports at the border, as I suggested before, then we're able to recover estimates of these key parameters, these key facts about the VAT in each country. The main thing I'll talk about today is the domestic compliance gap, which is defined as the VAT revenue that's lost due to non-compliance by domestic firms. The next thing I'll talk about a little bit less is the aggregate compliance gap. And that is simply the domestic compliance gap adjusted for the fact that even if domestic firms are not complying, to the extent that they're purchasing imports on which there's embedded VAT, some of that revenue sticks to those firms and sticks in the system. So the aggregate compliance gap is simply domestic compliance gap adjusted for that extra VAT collected at the border on inputs and not refunded. And then the last key gap to think about here is the policy gap. And that is the loss in revenues, the extent to which C efficiency falls below 100%. That's not due to compliance behavior of taxpayers, but it's due to the explicit policy choices of governments, such as rate reductions and exemptions and other measures that are deliberate choices that tend to reduce VAT revenues as well. So using our method and using this assumption, we're able to recover estimates of all of these things for groups of countries or for individual countries as well. So I'm going to show you some of the results from the paper and some of the pictures, but let me start just by giving an overview of what those results are, and particularly what I think they imply for policy in a country like Brazil that's considering adopting a destination-based VAT for the first time. I think the first result is that domestic non-compliance gaps are very large around the world. They're especially large in countries that we believe have, based on standard measures, that have problems in governance, problems in tax enforcement, and potentially problems in tax morale as well. So we're going to estimate this separately for different groups of countries. What we find is that the domestic compliance gap is 30% on average for the countries in our sample around the world. But it's as high as 64% of VAT revenue lost on domestic sales in the bottom 20% of countries ranked by the World Bank's governance index for the control of corruption. So we're going to rank countries by what the World Bank says is perceptions of corruption within the country. The bottom 20% of countries perform very poorly in terms of this compliance gap measure, on average 64% non-compliance with the tax. Now, that being said, these numbers look big to me, but they're all smaller than the revenue losses due to deliberate policy choices. So if our only concern were revenue loss, then of course, we shouldn't be talking about compliance. We should be talking about the policymakers and their tendency to apply reduced rates to some sectors and give excessive exemptions and so on. That results in greater loss of revenue than what I'm talking about today. But of course, compliance gaps are more important because they suggest, to me at least, they suggest a higher level of productivity loss in the economy as well. So we should be very concerned about the compliance gaps. Now, these numbers are for the domestic compliance gaps. As I said, the aggregate compliance gap will be lower because even if firms are non-compliant, we are collecting VAT on their imported inputs. And our results show that import VAT is very important in limiting the overall revenue loss. There are some further policy implications of that. In particular, the border is very important in protecting the tax base and reducing non-compliance. In one part of the paper, which I won't present to you today, we look at what happens in Europe when new countries accede to the common market and therefore stop collecting VAT on imports from other European community members after the change, because of what the Europeans call the reverse charge method of collecting tax in those cases. And we find some evidence that for Eastern European countries that joined the European Union over the last 15 years, some of those countries with the lowest institutional quality, as we measure it, seem to have greater problems of non-compliance after they join the European market and start using the reverse charge mechanism, and so give up on the import VAT collections for a large percentage of imported inputs. So the lesson there, I think, is beware the common market. If the domestic enforcement institutions aren't there, you need to keep collecting at the border. And the last thing that I'll do in this presentation is I'll say more about these institutions. So far, I've just been talking about institutional quality and the control of corruption without any indication of what that actually means in the data. We perform some additional analysis where we regress these compliance gaps we estimate on other institutional factors. And we find that with controls for things like GDP of the country and other institutional variables, we find that the compliance gaps for a country are smaller when they have greater financial sophistication, greater use of financial intermediaries in their economy would lead to lower compliance gaps. So banks are good for collecting VAT, but also compliance gaps are lower where the country, according to World Bank metrics again, where the country is tighter at regulating businesses. And so that's another sign for me that enforcement institutions matter here. It's important to regulate business, measure what business is doing, and enforce the tax in order to collect the tax. So I'll get back to some of those results, but those are the key messages, I think. Okay, well, this slide is here just for any economists and analysts in the audience. I'll be very brief about the details of what we're doing. 74 countries, data back to 1991. These are national accounting data sources collected by the IMF. And it's standard least squares regression with some additional controls other than the import to consumption ratio I've talked about. But the important thing is I'm going to group similar countries together here. But when I group countries together, I'll always include year fixed effects and country fixed effects so that all of my results are driven by those pictures I showed you, the correlation between import changes and VAT changes within countries over time, not differences across countries. And how am I going to group the countries? We do it by region of the world, by geography, but also by these measures of institutional quality or tax morale here. And we'll even go so far as to use a polynomial regression specification so that we'll be able to recover a separate gap estimate for each one of our 74 countries. And I'll show you that picture. These are the main results, and I'll be very brief in talking about regression results here, because I suspect I'm running out of time, to be honest. Somebody should tell me if I am. But this doesn't tell you everything about our specification, but it summarizes the important things. What I'm highlighting now is for the 5 different quintiles, that is the 20% groupings of countries by the control of corruption as measured by the World Bank. This is the main coefficient we're estimating, the impact of the import ratio on the C efficiency rate in the country. And so that's how we're estimating this. As I said, based on our simple model, we're able to turn those estimates into estimates of the compliance gaps. And so I'll simply talk about these instead. What this picture tells you is that in the middle quintile, that is in the middle of the distribution of institutional quality of countries, we see the domestic compliance gap is 28.7% of revenue. In the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%, the compliance gap is 64%. And the stars tell you the statistical significance of what I'm doing. Of course, I'm not highlighting the top 2 quintiles in the distribution of countries. Here, there is a small compliance gap, but it's statistically insignificant. And so this story about compliance is a story about the bottom half of the distribution of countries by institutional quality. And as I say, those numbers, to me, were surprisingly large. Increasingly, I realized that these numbers are consistent with other estimates that have been done country by country in the past, but our methods, of course, include all countries and are consistent with that. Now, as I said before, and I'll say again briefly, the aggregate compliance gap, adjusting for the extra VAT collected on imports, is not nearly so shockingly large as the domestic compliance gaps I just talked about. In the middle quintile of countries, it's simply 8%. So, if you like, fully 20% of the revenue that's lost due to non-compliance is captured through this unrecovered tax on the imports, according to our estimate. And then the last part of this calculation is the policy gap, which you see ranges between 20% and 40%. The countries with the lowest institutional quality, in fact, have a lower policy gap, or losing less revenue due to policy choices than those with the highest institutional quality. That actually makes sense. These countries in the top 2 quintiles are European countries. European countries probably have good enforcement of their VAT, but they don't have, perhaps, and Rita may correct me later, they don't have the best design of the VAT. And so they lose revenue due to policy choices. These countries at the bottom tend to be smaller emerging economies and low-income economies that adopted VAT more recently based on the advice of the IMF. And they designed modern VATs that result in lower losses due to policy choices, but they still have high losses due to compliance. Here are our estimates again, but now presented country by country. And so I don't know how visible this is, frankly. That will help, I think. And so this will just give you a sense of the range of the estimates we have. This is the percentage compliance gap here, which ranges obviously for the countries at the bottom of distribution between 40% and nearly 100% of domestic value added revenue lost due to non-compliance. And you can see that there is a generally downward sloping relationship with the institutional quality index that we're using. You can also see that it's largest here in African countries, in emerging economies in Asia, and the next highest grouping of countries by geography is in Latin America and the Caribbean. We don't have a lot of data, frankly, for Latin America, but the average compliance gap in Latin America is 55%. Of course, we don't have Brazil in our data set because Brazil so far does not have a destination-based VAT. And the last thing you'll see is that it's small and statistically insignificant in most European countries. These are mostly European countries. Northern Europe is here, insignificant in almost all cases, and we see some Southern and Eastern European countries in this range here. Just a couple of observations on benchmarking our results, showing how our results relate to others' estimates. First is that our estimates, again on this axis, are broadly similar to other estimates of the share of informality in the domestic economy. So here I've plotted our estimates against the estimates from a paper by Professor Schneider and co-authors of some years ago. And you can see that they're broadly related, but we tend to find more non-compliance among countries with middling values of the informality problem. And that kind of makes sense, I think, because VAT non-compliance is not just about informality, it's about other behaviors such as false invoices and so on. And the second benchmarking is simply to compare our estimates for European countries to what the European Commission publishes itself. So these are the case gaps. People who work in this area either know the case study or the previous Reckon study, which uses accounting methods to try to measure revenue losses due to non-compliance in European countries. So we've just plotted those estimates against our own estimates. Here, the vertical lines are our 95% confidence intervals. you can see that we largely match what the European Commission says about its own non-compliance problems, with a few exceptions. Croatia looks worse to us, the Czech Republic looks better, but broadly the story is the same in our approach as in the accounting methods that we're already familiar with. Let me conclude by saying a bit more about institutions here. I must say I'm not entirely comfortable with using this World Bank Corruption Perception Index and simply calling it institutional quality or governance quality, which I've called it several times already. We don't really know what that index means or how it's affecting compliance behavior in the economy. And we know that those indexes the World Bank produces, they're correlated with many other factors, including, of course, per capita income of countries. And so to say that there's some causal link between this corruption perception index and VAT compliance, I'm not saying that. It doesn't follow from what we've done. Instead, we're simply trying to group similar countries together, measuring that by this corruption perception index. So I'd like to say more about which institutions may actually, in some causal sense, be driving the non-compliance gaps. The way we get at that, and it is very crude, I admit, is we do a second step regression here. We take our estimates of the gaps that I've just shown you, and we regress them on other more finely tuned measures of institutions of countries. And so, and in doing this, we'll have controls for country's stage of development, for the corruption perceptions, and many other factors. So we'll be able to tease out the independent influence, we hope, of these other factors. And here again, we'll go to the World Bank. Because we have so many countries, to understand their institutions, we'll draw on the World Bank's doing business indicators here. We find that the compliance gaps are larger here. There's more non-compliance, where the World Bank says it's easier to do business. So when a country gets a higher score from the doing business indicators, they get less VAT revenue. And that, again, that might be surprising at first. I don't think it should be surprising. This is a story about the role of government in business regulation, a point that Tim Besley made very well in a paper a few years ago about the DB indicators. The doing business indicators are measuring the cost of doing business, some of which are very important for running the tax system of the country. And that's what we find here. We also looked at the measure of the ease of registering property in a country. That was prompted by this comment from one of the doing business reports that I noted. They wrote in 2018, they wrote, Botswana made registering property more difficult. Therefore, they got a worse value on the doing business indicator. They made registering property more difficult by adding a requirement to notify the tax authority of the value added payment. Well, any of you who worked in this area know how important real property is in VAT revenues in many countries. And you know that there's a lot of potential for non-compliance within the housing sector, the real property sector. Of course, linking the registration of property to the VAT payment is a very important part of making the tax system work. So that's all I'll say about that. I will mention that financial depth also matters. There's a number of papers by economists suggesting that a more developed financial sector causes taxpayers to use intermediation. And the government doesn't have to monitor every taxpayer, they just have to monitor the intermediaries. Well, we have some results that are consistent with that. A country that has more private credit as a ratio of GDP tends to have better compliance, according to our measures. Okay, so if I am over time, I do apologize. I'll very briefly conclude by saying the story of this paper is that because there's better compliance with VAT at the border, we expect to see a correlation between imports and revenues in countries that have a compliance problem. And using that very simple idea, we've just gone out to estimate how much non-compliance there is. We conclude that gaps are large in the domestic economy, but border controls keep the overall revenue loss small. Now, that's not the end of the story. I think it suggests a lot, but one of the things it suggests is that VAT still works as a way of collecting revenues. But in a country that has a compliance problem, VAT is not operating like a consumption tax. It doesn't fit our standard theory of what the VAT is. VAT starts to operate much more like a tariff or an import tax in those countries. And so that's important for thinking about the economic implications of having a VAT in place. And that takes me to the last point I want to make. VAT is an important element of revenue mobilization in low-income and middle-income countries. And so understanding and dealing with these compliance gaps is very important. We find that the gaps do vary with institutional quality. They do depend on financial sophistication and on the quality of business regulation. And where institutions are poor, then there will be a compliance problem. And effective border controls are a very important part of making VAT work at all here. And so as you're talking about VAT, I would say make sure that you're talking to your customs authority and not just your domestic tax authority. So thank you very much. And again, my apologies if I'm over time. I have no idea.
Professor, muito interessante, dados relevantíssimos para quem está discutindo uma reforma tributária como o Brasil. Muito interessante. Eu gostaria de passar a palavra agora para o professor Bernard Api.
Professor Smart, primeiro agradecer a sua apresentação, extremamente interessante. Espero que da próxima vez o senhor possa vir ao Brasil mesmo, conhecer melhor o sistema tributário brasileiro e conhecer o trabalho que está sendo feito aqui no Brasil, mas muito interessante. O paper é extremamente interessante do ponto de vista de modelo econômico, é uma forma muito engenhosa de tentar estimar o gap de compliance doméstico dos países. Eu tenho dois pequenos comentários sobre o paper que eu gostaria de fazer. O primeiro é uma questão metodológica que pode ser relevante em alguns países. Países que têm mais dificuldade de acesso a crédito internacional, é muito provável que haja uma correlação entre o nível de importações e o nível de exportações, principalmente países mais pobres. E esses países são também países em que a devolução de crédito para os exportadores tende a ser menos eficiente. Então, é possível que uma parte do aumento de receita que aparece nos seus estudos como correlacionado ao aumento de volume de importações seja, na verdade, consequência da falta de devolução de crédito para as exportações. Eu acho que seria interessante estudar isso dentro do modelo para ver se isso é relevante ou não. Segundo, o próprio paper menciona isso, mas uma parte daquilo que aparece como um gap de compliance doméstico, na verdade, pode ser um problema de desenho de política tributária, especialmente no caso de pequenas empresas. Eu vou dar um exemplo, o Brasil não está na amostra, mas no Brasil nós temos um regime para pequenas empresas em que o limite de enquadramento como pequena empresa é maior que $1 milhão por ano. E essas empresas não recolhem imposto sobre valor adicionado, elas recolhem um imposto sobre o faturamento e, portanto, nessas empresas, a perda de receita decorrente desse sistema apareceria no modelo como um gap de compliance doméstico, quando, na verdade, é um problema de política tributária e de desenho da política tributária e talvez, não sei, mas talvez seja relevante para os resultados do paper. Mas ainda assim o paper é extremamente interessante. O que me chama muito a atenção é que quando você vê a distribuição do gap de compliance doméstico em função desse índice de qualidade institucional, esse indicador de corrupção, nós vemos uma queda de 28% de gap de compliance doméstico, quase 29%, para o terceiro quintil, para 3% no quarto quintil. E, na verdade, estatisticamente, igual a 0 no quarto quintil. E isto, para mim, chamou muito a atenção. Quer dizer, qual a diferença que existe do ponto de vista de qualidade institucional de um país que possa ter uma diferença tão grande entre esse terceiro e o quarto quintil e o que precisa ser feito? Eu acho que essa é a grande questão. O que precisa ser feito para reduzir ao máximo possível o gap de compliance doméstico? Eu acho que essa é a questão que fica em aberto. Inclusive, um pedido, se fosse possível depois divulgar os dados mais detalhados por países. O paper tem só alguns dados por países, se pudesse divulgar outras estimativas de país, desde o C-Efficiency que vocês estão usando até os outros dados. Eu acho que o ponto final aqui agora, que eu queria colocar, é um pouco o que pode ficar de lição para o Brasil desse paper. Eu acho que essa é uma questão que eu queria colocar. Nós estamos discutindo no Brasil uma reforma tributária que busca substituir os tributos sobre bens e serviços que nós temos no país, que são muito ruins, por um imposto com características de um IVA moderno, com alíquota uniforme para bens e serviços, pouquíssimas exceções, idealmente nenhuma exceção, mas a alíquota desse imposto no Brasil vai ser muito alta. A estimativa mais otimista de alíquota que nós mesmos fizemos é uma alíquota de 25% de IVA. Tem alguns estudos independentes que indicam uma alíquota próxima entre 25% e 27%, e o governo agora acabou de soltar uma proposta só para 2 tributos federais, com uma alíquota de 12%, que se nós fôssemos expandir para todos os tributos sobre bens e serviços no Brasil, resultariam num IVA com uma alíquota de entre 30% e 35% no Brasil, extremamente elevada para padrões internacionais. E, obviamente, a redução do gap de compliance é fundamental para que a alíquota seja a mais baixa possível. O Brasil, em geral, não está muito bem no indicador do Banco Mundial de facilidade de fazer negócios. E uma parte disso é, de fato, as exigências do fisco brasileiro, que são muito altas, por um lado, tem um lado positivo de reduzir a evasão, mas, por outro lado, tem o lado negativo de aumentar muito o custo para as empresas, ser um custo bastante alto para as empresas brasileiras. Eu acho que, então, o grande desafio é como tentar compatibilizar um sistema que reduz ao máximo possível o gap de compliance doméstico com a facilidade de fazer negócios para as empresas. Quer dizer, o resultado do seu trabalho mostra, olha, países que facilitam, em que há muita facilidade de fazer negócios, na verdade, muitas vezes tem um gap de compliance maior que países que têm mais dificuldade de fazer negócios. E o grande desafio é como compatibilizar isso. Aqui no Brasil, nós estamos tentando fazer isso através do máximo possível de informatização. Nós já temos no Brasil um sistema muito evoluído de notas fiscais eletrônicas, Electronic Invoices, está bastante desenvolvido, e a ideia é montar todo o sistema de tributação do IVA brasileiro em cima da generalização do sistema de notas fiscais eletrônicas, o que é possível fazer no nosso país. Isso talvez viabilize compatibilizar um nível baixo de gap de compliance doméstico, talvez um pouco mais complicado para o caso de serviços intensivos em mão de obra prestados para consumidores finais, aí pode ser que tenha um problema, com o objetivo de facilitar o negócio para as empresas. Mas o trabalho foi muito instigante, deixou várias questões em aberto para nós pensarmos aqui no Brasil. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, professora Pi. Gostaria de passar a palavra agora para a professora Melina Rocha.
Bom, professor, de novo, professor Michael, seu paper é maravilhoso. Eu não sou economista, mas a forma como está escrito está muito bem, tão explicado que qualquer não economista também entende. Eu, lendo o seu paper, eu pensei em uma questão específica que eu vou trazer aqui. Então, uma das suas conclusões justamente é que a compliance do IVA, né, geralmente é muito maior nas importações do que para as transações domésticas, isso, obviamente, por conta do controle de fronteiras, que permite, então, esse alto nível de compliance. E aí, os seus resultados, então, apontam para esse importante papel do controle de fronteiras e o controle da não conformidade, né, do compliance. Enquanto eu li o seu artigo, professor, eu fiquei imaginando como que a gente leva em consideração, qual a relação que a gente pode colocar nessa discussão com relação às importações que são feitas por meio da economia digital, seja ela de bens intangíveis, seja de serviços, que são cada vez mais uma realidade, e você muito bem sabe que muitos países estão procurando, implementando soluções justamente para aumentar o compliance dessas atividades da economia digital, seguindo as diretrizes da OCDE, e aí nós temos uma série de soluções, né, como o mecanismo de reverse charge, ou o registro obrigatório para não residentes, para suppliers que são não residentes, principalmente em operações B2C. Então, em todo mundo, todos os países estão discutindo justamente esse controle da economia digital, que não é um controle tão fácil, tão simples, porque justamente esses produtos e serviços são intangíveis. Então, eles são importações, mas eles não passam por fronteiras. E aí eu fiquei curiosa para saber, eu vi, pelo que eu entendi, a sua presunção é que o gap, né, o compliance das importações é de 100%, mas se a gente leva em consideração essas importações que têm um gap muito maior, como é que a gente pode interpretar isso, como é que a gente pode levar em consideração e quais seriam os resultados se a gente levar em consideração todo esse gap de importações da economia digital, né? Vai aumentar, diminuir o gap doméstico ou não? Então, eu fiquei curiosa para saber como que a gente poderia se integrar essa questão da economia digital no seu paper. Bom, e seriam só essas minhas considerações, Bárbara, obrigada.
Obrigada, professora Melina. Gostaria de passar a palavra agora para a professora Rita Della Féria.
Bom, as minhas primeiras palavras vão ser em português, para dizer efetivamente que isto é um excelente paper. Eu estou numa posição privilegiada e tenho um especial orgulho do paper, porque eu estava lá quando o Michael e o Arthur tiveram a ideia deste paper. Estava lá no princípio, estava presente durante as primeiras discussões deste paper, há muitos anos atrás. Portanto, tenho um orgulho especial em ver o quão bem este paper resulta no final. Eu vou fazer agora umas considerações mais técnicas e vou passar agora para inglês. Eu sei que o preferia, a FG em geral preferia que eu falasse em português, mas nestas questões técnicas para mim é mais fácil falar-me em inglês. Michael, I have just a few points that I would like to make from a technical perspective. First of all, I think this measurement is great, and I think one of the things that is worth highlighting is the comparative advantages that it has to the normal VAT gap measurement. In particular, is not just able to discern between domestic and non-domestic and import compliance, but I think it's also the fact that the compliance gap measures other things, not just fraud. What can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Tá cortando pouco, professora.
Então vou fazer um minuto e vou fazer um esquema.
Acho que então podemos passar para o professor Michael. Acho que já tem algumas perguntas bem interessantes, né? Enquanto a professora Rita consegue. Ótimo. Michael, acho que tem muitas perguntas muito interessantes. Já gostaria de fazer uma mais. Eu acho que o professor Bernard Api tocou em um ponto muito interessante, que temos dados muito interessantes, o que isso pode ensinar para o Brasil, né? E se vocês me permitem, eu gostaria de fazer mais uma pergunta, que é o seguinte: no Brasil nós temos um grande mercado informal, né? A partir dos dados que o senhor colheu, o que isso poderia dizer, o que isso poderia ensinar para a gente em termos de passar para um modelo de tributo único? Professora Rita, não sei se a senhora quer...
Agora já me estão a ouvir melhor?
Sim.
Okay. Sorry, Michael. I was just saying that there was a few technical points. The first is on the comparative advantages with the normal VAT gap measurement. And it's not just the fact that it has domestic versus imports, but I think there is another critical point, is that on imports, there is no avoidance and limited negligence, which the VAT gap measurements in general measure that. So this has the advantage of actually being able to identify specifically fraud compliance as opposed to a general compliance measurements that you have. The second, on the import on VAT in Europe and the common market, the points that you made earlier, I think that the issue is not only the border itself, but what I think is happening is also a timing issue. there is a time delay that the reverse charge imposes that I think has an implication for compliance. So I think that it's that time delay as much as the non-existence of borders. And finally, I was curious because I thought I thought that there was some endogeneity on the compliance gap with the policy gap, as in one was dependent on the other. And from your presentation, it seems that the two are separate. So the Europeans have high compliance gaps, even though they have a very high policy gap. As high compliance gaps, yeah, even though they have a high policy gap. Is this the case? So because the two, I thought the two were always correlated. So the more you had, the more narrow base you had, the higher the compliance gap. And in your results, I didn't see that correlation. So I wonder if this is a thing, if I have been wrong all the time, or if you weren't able to control for that. I don't know. So I'm just curious with that. I also had a doubt that Bernard Api has already raised, which is the issue of them not real revenue increase. So a distorted revenue increase, which could be the result of not giving credits, or because it's going after other people that are not, I mean, through what we call in law the third-party liability or joint and several liability rules. So basically getting revenue from others that are not to do with normal compliance increases of revenue. So, I mean, yeah. So I was just wondering about that as well. But that's it. It's a fantastic paper, and I'm really glad you came over to present it here.
Obrigada, professora Rita. Gostaria, então, de passar a palavra para o professor Michael Smart, novamente.
Thank you very much all for those excellent comments. I probably won't respond to everything that everybody said, of course. I'm going to try to emphasize the policy aspects. There were some very good comments about the statistical aspects of what we're doing, which I'll try to reply to, but in the context of talking about the policy issues. And so here I have to choose what to focus on. Let me pick up on the last thing that Rita de la Feria said and that Bernard Api said earlier. I don't think that I believe that our results about compliance gaps really reflect tax evasion behavior. Now, Professor Api pointed out correctly that in principle, our results could be driven not by tax evasion behavior, but by the system of small trader exemptions. The fact that in essentially every country, small firms are not part of the normal VAT system, and they do not receive input tax credits for their purchases anyway. And Professor Api explained that in the Brazilian context. It's true in every country around the world that there's some turnover threshold below which no refunds would be paid anyway. I don't think that is driving our results. And there are two reasons. One is, even though that's true of a large percentage of the number of firms, it's true for a very small percentage of overall value added. There are many, many small firms, and they don't drive the results. So they would receive a lower weight. Those small traders that are below the threshold would receive a small weight in our regressions. They wouldn't drive the results that we're getting. But we have directly tried to address that by, in our second step regressions, we regress the compliance gaps on the level of the small trader exemption in each country relative to GDP per capita. We found there was no correlation at all with that, suggesting that, right, all else equal, a country that has a higher turnover threshold for the VAT, it doesn't have a higher measured non-compliance in our data. Those firms are not driving our results. But I think refunds are an important part of this. So to stay on the policy side of the important issues that people raise, it's absolutely true that our model, our theoretical background to doing this assumes a textbook VAT where all firms, if they are compliant, they receive refunds for all of their input tax credits and immediately. Professor De La Feria raised an important point about possible delays in the reverse charge. I'll have to think about that more. I haven't thought about it so far, Rita, because I didn't get advice from a good econometrician like you on this. But let's think about refunds in general, and particularly refunds on exports here. Professor Appy mentioned that. It's absolutely true that many countries, when they first introduce VAT, they don't pay 100% refunds immediately. And the IMF keeps going back to them and saying, you must pay refunds, especially on exports and especially immediately. But of course, countries are very reluctant to do that. And partly it's just for revenue reasons, but partly because the tax authorities think that paying refunds too easily will lead to non-compliance problems. So that is a potential problem in what we're doing, which I have not thought about carefully so far. All I can say is that in terms of whether it creates a problem for our estimates, we have checked whether our results are driven not by imports, as we believe, according to our theory, but driven by exports. We've done additional specifications where we control for the share of exports in consumption, and the results with those additional controls don't change. So this is a comment for the economists in the audience, obviously. We controlled for that, nothing changed. But I think it is really an important issue that we don't have a full handle on. It's possible that our results could partly be driven by countries operating a VAT, and it's not that the firms are non-compliant. It's just that the government is not paying the refunds, particularly to exporters. And so then particularly, imports that are immediately re-exported, that could be driving our results. But it is true that although countries are slow to pay refunds of ITCs, they always pay them on the exporters first. And so I hope that that's not driving our results in any large measure. The other important issues raised, Professor Appy mentioned the VAT rate. 25% would be one of the highest in the world, of course, if that were to be applied. I would say that let's remember that the VAT is still one of the most effective taxes in the world, notwithstanding the 64% non-compliance I've shown at the bottom. This is still a tax that essentially works around the world. Although we didn't talk about it today, we do have an estimate of how much non-compliance changes when the VAT rate goes up within a country. So there we have a control for the standard rate of VAT. And we do estimate that when the rate goes up, non-compliance goes up. But the effect is very small. I think the elasticity is 0.1 or something like that. And so small relative to what we believe about non-compliance responses to tax rate increases in other spheres. So I am a believer in VAT, notwithstanding what we've said. I think that the design means that it's the best option among most that could be considered. I will also mention the last point raised by Barbara about the problem of informality and what this has to say about that. Of course, informality is a problem for revenue mobilization, raising taxes anywhere. There's a I associate this idea with Brazil because Professor Jose Scheinkman wrote a very smart paper on this some years ago. This particular question about the role of informality in VAT collections. I said before that, because we're getting the tax on the inputs, that even if the firm chooses to drop out of the VAT base, at least we're getting some revenue. Professor Scheinkman pointed out that can be a double-edged sword. That can work against you as well. If within one particular VAT chain, one industry chain, all the firms decide to drop out, then that creates a kind of a cascade effect, a vicious spiral, where now all firms in that VAT chain want to drop out as well. That was Professor Scheinkman's point, that it could be a vicious cycle as well as a virtuous cycle resulting from the unrefunded VAT on the inputs. And all I would point out here is, notice that the imports break that chain. As long as some firms in the chain are using a lot of imported inputs, then we can break that tendency of firms to say, oh, I'm going to drop out of the VAT base. I'm going to unregister because all of my other trading partners are unregistered. As long as they're importing and as long as we can collect tax on their imports at the border, we'll reduce that tendency. And so I think that's another advantage that our paper points to. Informality is a problem, but we can control it at the border. The digital economy, Professor Rocha mentioned, we have not thought strongly about that, except for, so I will only say that our paper points to the importance of getting digital taxation right. And getting it right means taxing on a destination basis. Don't use reverse charge. Don't use the origin basis. Find a way to get those digital sales or those remote sales into your domestic tax base using the invoice and credit. Tax the stuff when you see the stuff. From a policy perspective, I think that's always a lesson of VAT. If you see some economic activity, tax it and make the taxpayer come back to you and say, you owe me a refund. I can see Rita kind of nodding there. Of course, we go around the world and we say that. That is why VAT works. And so when it comes to the policy design, if we can see it, and increasingly we know how to see digital sales, we should tax it and then let the taxpayer come to us and say, give us our money back. I probably talked enough. I haven't answered all of those excellent comments, but thank you very much.
Professor, se der para fazer uma última pergunta, chegou uma pergunta aqui de uma pessoa que está assistindo a gente, que eu acho que está bastante relacionada ao que o senhor falou, de como um aumento na alíquota pode gerar um pouco um aumento na não conformidade. E a pergunta é o seguinte: existe algum estudo que demonstra quais são os limites para a aplicação de um IVA em que todos os contribuintes efetivamente considerem mais interessante a prática de compliance ao invés de uma prática de não conformidade? E eu acho que abro já para consideração final, Eurico. Então, por favor, professor, se pudesse também.
I'm going to ask you, please forgive me, to clarify the question. I didn't understand.
Perdão, acho que a pergunta dizia a respeito...
Bárbara, quer que eu traduza mais ou menos?
Por favor, Rita, obrigada.
Nada. So the issue is, in essence, whether a higher rate of VAT has an impact on non-compliance behavior. And if there is a correlation between the two. I mean, there is this supposition. I mean, it goes back to the Laffer curve type scenario, right? That compliance decreases as the rate increases. And because you mentioned this, and Bernarda P. mentioned this as well, there is a question from the audience asking, is there a correlation between Brazil introducing one of the highest rates in the world? Should we expect a lower level of compliance because of that?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I think that our paper offers one of the few formal estimates of how compliance is affected by the VAT rate. As I said before, we find a higher rate does raise non-compliance, but not very much. Compared to other taxes and estimates of so-called tax-based elasticities for other taxes, the number we get is relatively small. There have been some other studies that have tried to do this for individual countries or for groups of countries. But of course, our estimate is the most reliable. I have to tell you that. You should conclude that there is a small elasticity. I will point out that when a VAT is first introduced, you should expect much bigger changes in behavior in the short run. So, of course, if you announce that next year the prices of everything are going up by 25%, not everything, of course, that's not how these reforms happen, but some things, the price will go up by 25%. Then you would expect consumption, purchases to rise immediately and then to fall in the year after or in the months after the tax is imposed. I've looked at the data for Canada, which introduced its much lower VAT in 1991. And there's a very striking effect of that kind. Of course, that's not non-compliance. That's avoidance behavior or just shifting in time. It's perfectly acceptable. It's, in fact, arguably part of how we make VAT work is that we can stimulate the economy in the short run by causing people to want to get their sales in before the tax goes into effect. So those effects are much stronger, so strong that some countries have even, of course, used VAT rate cuts as a way of stimulating their economy during a recession. If we estimated those elasticities, we'd get a higher number. But for the pure non-compliance, I think it's very small. I hope that there'll be more general discussion, but since Rita stepped in, I want to come back to another issue that she raised, and that is about the link between the policy gap and the non-compliance gap. And this is very much related to the point about the rates. I think, Rita, your belief is that if a country has a higher policy gap, then that's a worse design, which is farther from being a uniform VAT rate on everything, and therefore there should be more non-compliance. Well,
yeah,
I think
basically that there is a positive correlation between the two.
I think that a worse design, which might or might not be well measured by the policy gap, as you know, right? I mean, it's a very crude measure of non-neutralities in the base, and you've worked on that. But I think that a higher departure from uniformity in the tax will lead to more avoidance behavior, right? It'll lead to some sectors growing and others shrinking, but not necessarily to more non-compliance, right? So that's how I put it. I don't see a strong link between the policy gap and the departures from uniformity and an actual decision to evade the tax, for example, by not registering. There are some examples of that. Of course, some of the tax frauds exploit the difference in rates on two very similar transactions. So there are some examples of that, but the general sort of departures from uniformity that make up the policy gap, things like exemptions for certain sectors of the economy, reduced rates in food and housing and so on. I don't think that they're the main source of the non-compliance problems we're talking about. High rates are more likely to be the main source, particularly, as I said, for labor-intensive services, where the higher the rate goes, the greater the incentive to drop out of the base if you're a high value-added company.
That is really interesting. Sorry, Barbara. That is really interesting because to me it is counterintuitive. I really thought that there was a correlation between the policy and the compliance. So I find, just for that reason, I find the results really interesting. So.
Professor, a gente tem mais uma pergunta do professor Bernard e mais uma pergunta do professor Eurico.
Bom, professor Michael, só primeiro explicitando, quando nós falamos que a alíquota no Brasil seria de 25%, seria para um IVA moderno com um gap de política, um policy gap muito pequeno, e ainda assim a alíquota seria extremamente alta, porque os tributos que nós estaríamos substituindo hoje arrecadam um pouco mais que 12% do PIB. Mas a minha pergunta é sobre... no Brasil, uma das formas que nós utilizamos para resumir o gap de compliance doméstico é um uso muito extensivo de substituição tributária para frente. Significa que você cobra na indústria o IVA devido até o consumidor final para um número muito grande de produtos. Nós sabemos que isso é extremamente distorsivo do ponto de vista do desenho do sistema tributário, mas certamente tem o efeito de reduzir o gap de compliance doméstico. Eu gostaria a sua opinião sobre se o senhor entende que para um IVA com uma alíquota muito alta, se justificaria, em alguns casos, ter esse tipo de substituição tributária para frente.
Professor Eurico, quer?
Eu creio, Bárbara, que é melhor deixar o professor Smart responder o API primeiro.
Ótimo, professor Smart.
Sure. I'll just ask for clarification. Tax substitution, as the translator described it, I hope it translates back.
Reverse charge.
Yeah, it's reverse charge. So I'm going to ask Professor De La Feria to speak up. She's really more of an expert on reverse charge than I am. We would never use, well, we very rarely use it in Canada. I see, but I'll first say what I think Rita believes. I see reverse charge as a cure for tax fraud, which is worse than the disease in some cases. It has the potential to be worse than the disease. And so we have to be smart about enforcing the VAT, but we should not give up on the essential design feature of VAT, which, as I said before, crudely, is if you see economic activity, grab some tax and ask the taxpayer to come back to you for the refund. So we might worry about frauds that use invoice mills and so on that would lead us to think that we shouldn't try to tax the intermediate stages, but it puts all of the risk on the last stage, right? All of the enforcement risk goes onto that last stage of production, which tends to be a lot of small traders. It's very hard to control everyone at that stage of the production chain. And in the process, you've given up the fail-safe device that is at the core of VAT, which is the invoice and credit system. You're going to say it better, Rita, but what do you think?
Ok, so o Michael e eu já nos conhecemos há tantos anos, já nos conhecemos tão bem que ele já sabe o que eu vou dizer. Tem toda a razão, ele tem toda a razão, é isso mesmo que eu vou dizer. A substituição, eu já tive a oportunidade de dizer isto em círculos no Brasil, a substituição tributária é uma praga, porque é a pior emenda do que o soneto. Não sei se vocês têm essa expressão no Brasil, nós temos essa expressão em Portugal, é a pior emenda que o soneto, porque na prática o que acontece é que temos um imposto que tem uma falhinha pequenina e vamos aumentar para uma falha gigantesca, que é pôr todo o risco numa só fase da cadeia de produção. Portanto, estamos a transferir, estamos a pôr um sistema, por causa de uma falha pequena num imposto bom, estamos a transformar um imposto bom num imposto mau. Portanto, a substituição tributária é péssimo, e eu acho, não tenho obviamente dados relativamente ao Brasil, mas na minha opinião é provavelmente uma das grandes razões para os vossos problemas non-compliance atuais, é o facto de vocês não terem um sistema de invoice credit normal como é o sistema do IVA. E, portanto, eu acho que só essa transformação para aquilo que em inglês se chama third party reporting, para o reportar de terceiros que o IVA tem e que a substituição tributária retira, só isso vai aumentar o nível de conformidade no Brasil, na minha opinião.
Professor Eurico, gostaria de fazer mais uma pergunta?
Bárbara, vou fazer, acho que é uma última pergunta, não é? Para a gente terminar às 11h30, e eu queria pedir para o professor Isaías fazer o nosso fechamento, os agradecimentos e a conclusão do evento de hoje. Professor Smart, no Brasil nós temos o que o professor Isaías chama de um protótipo de IVA, que surgiu no começo dos anos 60 do século passado e que trouxe, enfim, uma formulação específica dentro de um país federativo, separando a competência para tributar serviços para os municípios, através da Constituição. A Constituição deu competência para os municípios tributarem serviços, os estados tributarem mercadorias, e a União tributar indústria. Uma coisa da realidade na década de 60. Daí a indústria foi caindo a atividade, o comércio mais ou menos se manteve estável e os serviços subiram. Em razão do Brasil, em grande parte, a atividade de serviços ser tributada pelas cidades, pelos municípios, eu tenho naturalmente um problema maior de enforcement. E a situação é que a carga tributária efetiva, hoje em dia, é que o setor de serviços é um pouco menos tributado do que o setor de comércio e o setor de indústria. Na proposta de reforma tributária, idealizada com o modelo moderno de IVA, a ideia é que as alíquotas sejam uniformes. E o que nós enfrentamos hoje em dia é um grande desconforto do setor de serviços, seja porque foi fortemente atingido pela pandemia, seja porque essa transição é difícil para todos, seja por falta de dados econômicos do que significa um modelo de tributação cumulativo, que para a esfera federal seria uma mudança do cumulativo de 3,65% para 12% não cumulativo. Na esfera federal, como disse o Bernardo Api, levando em consideração todos os tributos, seria algo em torno de 8,65% do cumulativo para 25% no não cumulativo. Isso causa um grande desconforto para o setor de serviços. E como é que, eu sei que não está no seu paper essa consideração, mas dentro da sua experiência, na visão da reforma do Canadá, qual a melhor maneira de lidar com isso sem prejudicar o setor de serviços, garantindo que não haja muita surpresa e garantindo dados para eles também, que mesmo os empresários não têm ideia do que significa efetivamente o imposto não cumulativo e não confiam que o Estado vai devolver o dinheiro das exportações e da não cumulatividade.
Really important question. I hope I can do justice to it briefly. So many countries, of course, start with a tax system that is supposed to tax sales or consumption, but it does not tax services nearly as much as goods. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is just history, as Professor Santi said, where services are less important. Also technology, the taxing at the point of retail sales would lead you to miss that. In the Canadian case, it was partly that. We did have a system with much lower taxes on services. It was partly just due to that history, but it was also due to the fact that we didn't have a system for taxing services on a destination basis across the provinces of the country. So that might be part of the problem in Brazil as well, where I guess you have an origin-based tax on services at the municipal level. And of course, those municipalities will never have the incentive to raise those tax rates enough because they worry about harming their domestic businesses, distorting trade, as we would say. And so now we know how to tax services on a destination basis within a VAT. And I think it helps to solve that problem. But the other thing that the federal government had to do in Canada, I know you're talking about Canada to others who probably have already told you some of this. The other thing that we had to do in Canada was the federal government had to ensure that the transfer system to the lower level governments was sufficient to compensate them for any losses from this. So the federal government putting some money on the table to help the municipalities, that was important in Canada. But none of that speaks to, I think, Professor Santi's main concern, which is the impact on the service businesses themselves and their resistance to paying the tax. Here, I'm not sure that I understood all of the language as translated about cumulative and non-cumulative tax, but I'm going to guess that the issue here in Brazil may be the same as it was in Canada, which is that it's hard to convince the businesses and the business associations that they're already paying the tax because it's embedded in the prices of the things that they're purchasing. And it's hard to convince the customers, yes, okay. So we would say embedded tax in Canada. It's hard to convince consumers and voters that the impact on the taxes is much smaller than it looks based on the statutory rates, because there'll be a reduction in business costs at the same time as an increase in the final tax rate. So all I can say to you is good luck with that. We had that battle several times in Canada, of course. I did one study after the introduction of a VAT to try to show that indeed was the impact on prices. For that, you'll have to actually implement the reform and get the data on the impact of prices. There are other good studies as well of what the incidence of these taxes are. Not all of the studies show what we economists believe. I do want to emphasize that. Some of the studies have shown that if you take off embedded taxes, the prices charged do not fall by the full amount of the tax reduction. So we should be cautious about that. The evidence is limited, and I don't think we understand why entirely. I mean, of course, we all know the businesses would like to charge more if they could. but we don't know why the competitive pressures aren't always there. But my own study for Canada was consistent with, broadly consistent with the prices changed by exactly the amount we would expect if all of the embedded tax came off from the prices and only the final tax went on. So I do think these taxes are shifted forward. The other thing I will say is that because services probably are being taxed on an origin basis, again, the incidence could change, right? So the fact that they're paying taxes at home, but they're competing against others in other municipalities or in other states that are not paying the same tax rate. We don't know economically that the impact on prices will be exactly 100% pass through or pass forward of the tax changes. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a complicated answer, and it's a very complicated area. Nobody likes change, and no one especially likes changes that involve increases in their taxes. The last thing I would say about this is the economic theory and the evidence helps to some extent, but I think that we should all be conscious of the moral arguments as well. There's a natural belief that I was paying less tax last year, so it's not fair that I pay more tax next year. That argument does not have a strong moral basis, and I think it's up to the professionals in the economics and legal community to say, no, last year wasn't fair. Next year will be fair. And so, again, all I can say is, with all these arguments, good luck.
Obrigado, professor Smart. Eu queria agradecer e muito a sua apresentação, a sua fala, sua generosidade para com o Brasil. Agradecer a nossa padroeira da reforma tributária, Santa Rita de la Féria, padroeira da reforma tributária brasileira. Agradecer o economista Bernardo Api pelo interesse na leitura do paper, pelas perguntas instigantes. A querida minha amiga Melina, por ter trazido o professor Smart, muito apropriado nesse momento. Acho que a gente já pode combinar um outro convite brevemente para o professor Smart. A Bárbara Mengardo, do Jota, a nossa jornalista que faz a mediação dos nossos eventos. Obrigado, Bárbara. Eu queria passar para o encerramento com o nosso querido professor Isaías Coelho. O professor Isaías Smart diz que o IVA funciona como uma maré. Quando ele sobe e desce igualmente para todos os navios. É assim, professor Isaías?
Obrigado, Eurico. Realmente um dia muito produtivo aqui. É um prazer. Nós recebemos o professor Smart. Posso mudar agora para o inglês, creio. Thank you, Professor Smart. Your intervention today helps us in the difficult task of design and especially implementing a modern VAT in Brazil. I am very happy that you are with us. I know your paper for a long time, and we share a common friend, Michael Kim, so I have followed your work for years. And also we are going to receive in this webinar series Professor Pierre Pascal Gendron in a few days. So we are having a good food for thought in this discussion. The study that you bring us today is quite relevant, but our concern is to overcome the resistance that arise from fear in the economic agents, that they will be worse off, that they will be displaced, that competition would play havoc with their businesses. So we are in this process. As you mentioned, no one can guarantee that the price adjusts quickly to the new environment. But the fact that the price may be sticky for some time doesn't detract from the fact that the tax element should not be a permanent element of distortion, we have to move to a more to a level playing field where business done on its merit, on its advantage and disadvantage, not according to taxation. I especially like your final consideration regarding incorporation of the service sector to the VAT, because it reflects clearly the great discussion that's taking place in Brazil. And you show that there are pros and cons, there are gains and loss involved, but the economic environment has to improve after this VAT is modernized, or to say in other words, as soon as we have a decent VAT, a modern VAT, because what we have here is quite imperfect. It's a first generation VAT, full of problems that have never been corrected. And in fact, by kind of entropy law, the tax has been deteriorating over time. So it's a moment that we have to make a sweeping reform, because the tax structure that we have is beyond repair. There is no way to fix it on a piecemeal basis. So that's what we are doing these days, and all economic agents are considering this situation. There is a great degree of loss in the economic sector, in the export sector, in industry especially, because of this dysfunctional tax regime that we have. So we hope that we can give this important step. And I have never been in a situation, have never seen in Brazil such a good momentum for tax reform as we have now. There is, we discuss which reform, what are the contours of the reform, but no one doubts that there is a need, urgent need of changing for better our tax system. So thank you very much. And Rico DeSanti, congratulations for realizing, for bringing to implementation this webinar and this very productive session. Thank you.
Bom, obrigado, professor, obrigado a todos, e encerramos nosso webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for a very interesting session.
Thank you, Professor.